Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm here to help you make the most of your mineral rights and royalties. And Justin Williams is here with me as always. Hey, Justin.
Hey, Matt. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming on the show and representing the individual mineral owner perspective. And this episode, we're going to talk about mineral rights news for March 2020. And before we get started, I just want to say thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you. And make sure that you subscribe and leave a rating and review on iTunes. It's the best way that you can help spread the word. Thank you for taking the time to listen. We'll get into some of the details around what's going on with the news in March and give you some insights to help you manage your portfolio. And as always, you can find links to these articles on our website, which is mineralrightspodcast.com. And so be sure to check that out. So Justin, what do you say we just go ahead and dive in on the first article?
Let's do it. Yep. So the first article we have here is titled, Gordon Promises Caution, Pitches Land Deal as an Investment. If the legislature gives its initial approval as a proposed deal to buy 1 million acres and 4 million acres of mineral rights, will test a numbers-minded governor as he negotiates with both a multinational energy corporation and political factions at home. The proposed land is in a checkerboard pattern of land along the length of the Union Pacific Railroad in southern Wyoming that is owned by Oxy, which it got as part of the Anadarko purchase in 2019. The article goes on to say the land has been in private hands since the U.S. government awarded it to Union Pacific as an incentive for railroad building beginning in 1862. The government gave every other 640-acre section for 20 miles on either side of the track to the rail company plus mineral rights. There have been those supportive of the potential deal and those that have opposed the land purchase, worrying that the state would be entering into an oil and gas business. The article quoted Governor Mark Gordon, who had this to say, "This is not our opportunity to build a state enterprise or anything like that," he said. "The state would merely own and lease the land the same way it owns 3.5 million service acres and 3.9 million mineral acres around the state today." So I think this is an interesting one, and I think there's going to be some opposition on both sides.
Yeah, and as we alluded to, this is coming out of Wyoming, and this is really interesting because when Oxy purchased Anadarko in 2019, like Justin mentioned, they inherited all of these minerals basically, and it sounds like they're trying to look at selling this as a way to raise money to help pay back that purchase. And this is really a huge opportunity for the state of Wyoming, I think. And there's two sides of this, like you mentioned, Justin. I think pros of this deal, in other words, the benefits would be that they would control their own destiny around the use of this land. And like the article mentioned, it's 1 million acres and 4 million acres of mineral rights. And so there could be a huge benefit from the leasing of the minerals, and then also through any oil and gas royalties that the state would receive, assuming that they can purchase this at a good price and so that they get a good return on their investment. Obviously, if they pay too much, they're not going to get that money back, and they're going to be draining the state coffers in doing so. So there's a risk to that. As far as the actual particulars of some of the land, one of the things that the article mentions is there are parts of Sweetwater County where this land is located that there is trona mining going on. And trona is sodium carbonate, and it's a source of soda ash, which is used in making things like glass and chemicals and paper and other things. And so with Oxy owning those minerals, it's sort of, they're not interested maybe in partnering or, with any of these trona mining companies. It sort of limits the competition in that area. And so one of the trona mining experts or companies was mentioning that they were seeing this as a positive since they wanted to deal with the state rather than having to deal with Oxy, as it would open up some of these lands for mining. And so I think it could be a really beneficial thing to the state. They, again, would control the use of the surface rights as well as the minerals, and then benefit from any development on those lands. And the only downside that I see here is they're going to have to dig pretty deep into their savings. And if the oil and gas markets continue to be depressed or go down even further, it could be many years before they see a return on the investment. So I think it's really going to be incumbent upon the Wyoming state legislature to do this in a very measured way. And obviously, they're going to get some external advisors to help them navigate this to make sure that it's a good investment. But this is a huge portfolio of land that's come on the table for the state to do something with. So it'd be interesting to see how this develops.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll dive into the next one. So this is also coming out of Wyoming, and it's a similar article in that it talks about, in this case, federal land buyback program. So the article is titled "Federal Land Buyback Program Comes to Wind River Reservation, Aims to Return More Land to Tribal Jurisdiction." So this article is talking about the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming and how some of the landowners there may be eligible to sell their land and return it back to, like the article says, to tribal jurisdiction. And the article says that participation in the program is voluntary. Only tribal members with allotments will be eligible to sell their lands, and that once back under tribal jurisdiction, the formerly fractionated land could be used by tribes for economic development, right of ways, cultural preservation, or housing, amongst other uses. So, what this article is talking about is a program that was developed by the U.S. Department of Interior after the government settled a case called Cobell v. Salazar, which created a $1.9 billion trust land consolidation fund. And the fund is to be spent within a 10-year period ending in November of 2022. And that settlement makes the funds available to the U.S. Department of Interior to acquire those fractional interests in trust or restricted lands from what they call, quote, individuals who are willing to sell their interests for fair market value. It places purchased interest into trust for tribes. The Department of Interior website also mentions that these transfers increase tribal trust land bases for conservation. And then, some of the other stuff like it was mentioned in the article. And so the article does say that there's around $204 million remaining in that trust for tribes wanting to participate in the program. And within the Wind River Reservation itself, it says that it's the 4.5% or almost 102,000 acres of lands that were once allotted to tribal citizens and still owned by their decedents. That land buyback program is aiming to recapture on behalf of the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho tribes that make up the reservation. It also clarifies that the program isn't going to touch the 471,000 acres of fee simple land. The reason I picked this article is because it's similar to how mineral rights become increasingly fractionated as they're passed down through generations. So now we have family members owning a very small percentage of what the original grant was. And in the same way, some reservation land was divided and allotted to individual citizens within tribes as part of what they called the General Allotment Act of 1887. And so the same thing happened as these allotments were passed down through the generations. You end up with potentially having thousands of allottees for a tract of land, which then basically becomes impossible for the tribe to use that in a beneficial way and get agreement from all the allottees on how that land is going to be used. And so, how this might affect oil and gas development in the Wind River Reservation remains to be seen. But I think that what it could mean is that the reservation lands that are owned by both the northern band of the Arapaho and the eastern Shoshone tribes, and each tribe has 50% interest in the natural resources. So, because of this, they dictate the regulations in place for oil and gas development within the reservation. And while it maybe is only a small percentage of the overall reservation lands, it might help encourage oil and gas development by centralizing the control over those surface rights back to the affected tribes. And so, what that would mean is if there's an ideal surface location for a new oil and gas well, rather than having to go and deal with dozens of allottees to try to get an agreement, they could go to the tribe and try to negotiate a surface use agreement directly with the affected tribes. And so, if that land is consolidated and returned back to the tribes, it will potentially streamline the process of getting approval to develop those lands, which then would, that could include oil and gas development amongst, they have grazing and other surface uses, but could mean more activity there and then, more royalties for the tribes.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And trying to negotiate, anytime you break it up into multiple pieces, it creates a bigger burden and makes it maybe less interesting for the companies to come in and develop. So I can completely understand why they're looking at that option. All right, so our last article here talks about global demand growth and how the head of the International Energy Agency said that they could trim its oil demand growth forecast further due to the impacts of the coronavirus outbreak. The IEA's executive director, Faith Burrell, told Reuters, "We certainly see the lowest oil demand growth in the last 10 years, and we may need to revise it downwards." The article also mentioned that OPEC also slashed its global oil demand growth forecast for 2020, expecting the coronavirus outbreak to weigh heavily on fuel demand and the world's oil demand growth driver, China. OPEC slashed its oil demand growth estimate by 230,000 barrels per day from last month's assessment and now sees global oil demand growth at just below 1 million barrel per day this year. And that exact figure is 990,000 barrels per day. This comes after the EIA revised their global petroleum consumption forecast down by 378,000 barrels per day as compared to their January 2020 short-term energy outlook. The EIA said that the change in the forecast is driven by a combination of lower than expected heating fuel consumption caused by the Northern Hemisphere's warmer than expected winter, an expected slowing of economic growth in general, and the particular economic effects of the 2019 novel coronavirus outbreak. So this is never really a great thing to hear, Matt.
Yeah, it's not a positive outlook for, at least in the short term, oil and gas prices. And so I would expect that we'd see depressed commodity prices for the foreseeable future due to the lower demand that they mentioned. Already we're in a period of potentially decreasing demand, and then this coronavirus outbreak, shutting down commerce is not helping things at all. So that we have this downward pressure on demand from several factors that were mentioned, and then we have this increased supply from US shale producers that are continuing to drill new wells. And while their growth projections are down from past few years, they're still forecasting positive growth in many cases. And so this is not going to help things until we get a better balance from a supply and demand standpoint to allow prices to come back up. And especially if we see more outbreaks outside of Asia, like we're starting to see in Europe and in the US, then demand issue could even get worse. And so I think this is definitely having an effect on the minerals market. Kind of the takeaway here, I think, is that, we're seeing a lot of companies that a year ago were actively purchasing minerals in properties that not necessarily were going to see a return immediately. And now they're pulling back and only in buying in areas where we're seeing definite short-term upside potential. So in other words, where there's a drilling rig that is on site, or maybe wells have been drilled recently and are waiting to be completed, or have been completed and just waiting to get the royalty checks coming in. And so I think those properties are still demanding a higher price, and that's where a lot of the activity is going on. Kind of like Will Collin mentioned in our interview with him with Long Point Minerals, and we're seeing that having a definite effect on the minerals market as a whole. And the reason for this, as we've mentioned before, is due to the time value of money. And if there's not a definite path to that return on investments, buyers are just not willing to take the risk and pay top dollar. They may still buy in areas outside of where immediate activity is going on, but they're only going to be willing to pay, much, much lower price because of just that lack of visibility to near-term development. So hopefully this turns around. Hopefully this whole coronavirus thing ends up being not that big of a deal. Certainly think about the flu and the effects of the flu and the amount of people that die from the flu and that actually catch the flu every year. Still, in my mind, is a lot more severe than what we're seeing with coronavirus, although I guess that could change if this thing continues to spread. But I wonder how much of this is being blown out of proportion. I don't know. What do you think, Justin?
I'm with you. It'll be interesting to see what ends up happening with this. And I think, depending on that, we're going to see a lot of economical impact from it either way. But on top of that, balancing that supply and demand is going to be critical as well.
Yeah, and I think regardless of whether or not coronavirus ends up being a severe outbreak scenario, the response to the outbreaks are what's causing the issue. And that's in terms of reduced economic activity, shutting in borders and towns and putting them in quarantine mode. And then you're not getting the commerce that we normally see that's, driving oil and gas demand. So hopefully this gets resolved here in the next few months. Otherwise, we could be in for a rough 2020 from an oil and gas price point of view.
You nailed it. And as with anything else, oil and gas, 3 to 4 months, we could be singing a totally different tune.
I hope you're right. All right. Well, that wraps it up for March 2020 Mineral Rights News. As always, please go to the show notes where you can get links to these full articles to find out more. And please leave us an honest rating and review. We definitely appreciate you, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks again, Justin.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.